Story number 1, Candy Apple. I've lived in the same neighborhood my whole life. It's one of those small, quaint places where everyone knows everyone, and you'll get into trouble if your lawn doesn't look as clean as the guys next to you. Anyway, I like it, and that's why I decided to stay. Even when I got older and had kids of my own, I still live in the same neighborhood only a few blocks down from the house I grew up in and where my parents still live. The coolest part about this neighborhood is the amount of effort everyone puts into decorating for Halloween. We even have competitions to see whose house looks the best. I haven't won yet, but I keep trying. When Halloween night comes around, it's kind of a given that the streets are filled with kids in costumes running from house to house, looking for candy. The local police department even blocks off the roads on either side to stop any cars driving down. I used to love going trick-or-treating when I was a kid, but stopped when I was around 16 years old out of fear of being teased by my friends. You never actually want to stop trick-or-treating, but eventually we all reach an age where you just have to. So, you can imagine my joy when my daughter was finally old enough to go out for her first night of trick-or-treating. On the night, we both got dressed up and headed out early. I'll admit, it was more for me than for her, but she was really looking forward to getting some free candy, and she wasn't complaining about getting to dress up and act like a princess for the whole night. We hit a few houses that I used to hit when I was younger. It was awkward at first, since I knew most of the people who answered the door, and they gave me strange looks due to the fact that I was dressed up like the Bride of Frankenstein. Still, I was really enjoying myself, and it seemed like my daughter was quickly becoming the avid Halloween lover like myself. We were about halfway through the night when my daughter started getting tired. I decided we could stop at one last house before heading back home. This house was on the edge of the street, and I can't say I'd been to it before. The garden wasn't as well kept as everyone else's, and there were very few decorations, aside from the random carved pumpkins and fake cobwebs. It seemed a little dodgy, but my daughter was on the sugar craze and practically dragged me to the door. We did the usual knock and yelled out trick or treat. We stood there, bags at the ready, and smiles on our faces. It was a while before someone came to the door. When the door swung open, it was slow and the hinges creaked as if it was the first time the door had been opened in years. The old and worn-out face of a woman appeared in a small gap in the door. She glared at us with her beady eyes. I was half expecting the door to slam in our faces a few seconds later. Instead, the woman's arm, which was skinnier than a twig, stretched out through the gap holding a single candy apple. My daughter's face lit up, and she snatched it from the woman. I reminded her to say thank you, and she did. The woman didn't react though. She simply slunk back into the darkness of her home and pushed the door closed. It was the weirdest encounter of the night. I held the candy apple as we walked home to stop my daughter from eating it on the way. As soon as we got home, I put her candy away and told her to get ready for bed. She'd already eaten some of it, so I figured that was enough for the night. I put her candy apple in the fridge and forgot about it for most of the evening. It was still early in the evening, and I was in the Halloween spirit. While my daughter slept, I decided to watch a few horrors and enjoy the rest of the night. After the second movie, my daughter's candy started looking pretty good. Before you say anything about stealing my daughter's hard-earned candy, I was going to replace anything I ate. So I went through her stash that I'd hidden away, and that was when I remembered the candy apple. You see, I knew my daughter would simply lick the candy off and then throw the apple away. It would be a waste. I decided to eat it and simply buy her another one on the way to school or something. I sat down on the couch, licking away the candy while the third horror movie of the night played. I got through the candy and reached the apple. As I bit into it, I felt a sharp, sudden pain in the roof of my mouth, and instead of tasting the juiciness of the apple, I tasted blood. I dropped the apple and raced to the bathroom. There was blood dripping from my mouth, and I couldn't see where it was coming from. At first, I thought I broke a tooth when I bit into the apple, but the pain wasn't around my teeth and they seemed fine. Once I got the bleeding under control, I went back to the apple and had a look at it. Once I washed my blood off, I could see the area where I bit into it, and there was the tip of a rusty nail sticking out from inside the apple. I almost vomited at the sight of it. You can probably guess what happened next. I woke my daughter up and dropped her off with a neighbor while her husband rushed me to the nearest hospital. They did blood tests for rust poisoning and got me patched up. I then contacted the police and sent them to the old woman's house. Part of me wants to feel guilty for stealing my daughter's candy in the first place, but then the other part of me is just glad she wasn't the one that bit into that apple. I can't believe there are monsters out there that would do something like that to an innocent child. Story number 2. An awful trick. I was one of those trick-or-treaters that actually followed through with the trick part of the deal. Basically, if someone didn't give me a treat, they got a trick. It wasn't just me, my friends joined in, and the tricks were their ideas most of the time. Back in 2005, I think I was around 14 at the time, my friends and I went out trick-or-treating for Halloween night. I can't remember what we were dressed up as, but I do remember we never really put a lot of effort into it. Anyway, most of the night was uneventful. We walked down a few streets and hit all of the houses with the best decorations because they were bound to have all the best candy. When we ran out of those houses, we started going to the mediocre ones. Most of them had candy, even if it wasn't good candy, but we came up to this one house that didn't give us any candy at all. We knocked on the door, and when the guy inside answered, he yelled at us to grow up and leave him alone. Naturally, we weren't just going to walk away. We gathered at the other side of the street and started planning our revenge. There were a lot of ideas being thrown around, and we eventually settled on the idea of breaking into the guy's house later that night while he was asleep. We moved on, finished up our trick-or-treating for the night, and made plans to meet back there after midnight. Let's just say, we didn't think that anything could really go wrong. We'd break into the guy's house, make some noise, scare the hell out of him, and then get out of there before he called the cops. As you can probably guess, that's not what happened. We all got there just past midnight and checked the place out. All the lights were off, so we figured the guy had gone to sleep. We made our way around the house until one of the guys spotted an open window around the back. It was small and low to the ground. It led to the basement and was just big enough for thin, prepubescent boys to fit through, which is probably why it wasn't closed or locked. I was the brave one, so my friends helped me climb through and lowered me down. They then handed me a flashlight and said they'd meet me by the front door where I would let them in. I never made it that far. I flicked the flashlight on and walked around the basement. I scanned each corner slowly. It seemed like your average basement. There were all sorts of boxes dumped down there, and a big metal furnace groaned loudly in the corner. Its soft orange glow didn't reach the back of the basement where I was, but it lit up what looked like the stairs to the exit. I headed that way, continuing to scan the room with my flashlight. That was when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. There was a metal gleam near the furnace. It was as if something shiny was reflecting the light. I turned towards it and squinted through the dark as I turned my flashlight in the same direction. Before the light hit it, I could see a shape moving in the corner beside the stairs. It wasn't noticeable at first, but there was a dark mass that seemed to sway and bob up and down slightly. As my flashlight shined on the dark mass, my heart stopped beating for a split second before a rush of adrenaline sent me running up the stairs in front of me and through the house. The man who had answered the door earlier in that night was sitting down in the basement. His eyes were wide open and unblinking, staring at me the whole time with a sickening scowl stretched across his lips. He was so still aside from the occasional breath, and in his hands he clutched onto the biggest, sharpest machete I have ever seen. It caught the light and blinded me for a moment. I didn't even have time to think. I was out of there so fast. I didn't want to know why he was just sitting down in the basement and what he'd planned on doing with that machete. I tripped and flew over all sorts of furniture as I ran through his house. I found a window, opened it, and threw myself through it. My friends were shocked, but when they saw me running for my life, they were quick to follow. I told them all about it later, and they thought I was just trying to scare them. It goes without saying that we didn't tell anyone else about it, but we never went back there, not even on Halloween. Story number 3. Too old for trick-or-treating. A few years ago, I was around 15 years old, and I had already made the decision to stay home for Halloween. My mother was half disappointed and half relieved. She liked seeing how excited I got about going trick-or-treating, but she also saw it as an opportunity to go out with her friends while I stay at home and hand out the candy. A lot of my friends were still going out that year, but I just thought I was too old for it. Instead, I ordered a pizza and spent the night playing horror games on my Xbox. I still love Halloween, so I wanted to do something to celebrate it. Even though my mother gave me instructions to hand out candy to anyone who came knocking, I wasn't really in the mood for that. I put the candy in a large bowl outside the front door with a sign that read, "Take one," and that was that. I locked up and prepared myself for a long night of uninterrupted gaming. I had finished my pizza about an hour into the gaming and was working my way through a few chocolates I stole from the bowl of candy my mother left out. The night flew by. I had heard a few footsteps running up the front porch, but no one knocked on the door. Then, as I was getting up to get myself a drink, I heard a soft knocking. I rolled my eyes and sighed. I figured the bowl of candy was empty and that I'd have to give up some of mine. I grabbed a handful of chocolates and headed to the front door. I opened it up, expecting to be greeted by the usual trick-or-treat screams, but there was no one there. The street was practically empty. I shrugged it off and closed the door. I got my drink and sat back down. However, before I could unpause my game, I heard another knock at the door. I was thoroughly annoyed at this point and practically stomped to the door. Again, as I flung the door open, there was no one there. This time, I stomped out, flung my fists into the air, and shouted at whoever it was to buzz off. I slammed the door closed and decided not to bother opening it again. I returned to my gaming. Not a moment later, I heard a knock again, but it wasn't coming from the front door this time. It was coming from the back of the house. I was still somewhat annoyed, but also a little worried at this point. I was convinced that some kids were playing a prank on me, but now they were running around to the back of my house and knocking on my back door. I wasn't even sure if the back door was locked. I got up, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and headed towards the back door. I checked that it was locked, and thankfully, it was. There was a window right beside it, and I pulled the curtain aside slightly and glanced out. It was really dark, but I could clearly see that there was no one there. I considered calling my mother, but as I turned around, I saw something that made my heart stop. Now, my house has a pretty normal design. There's a long hallway that moves through the whole house, from the front door to the back door. So while standing at the back door, I had a straight line of sight to the front door. As I turned around, I looked down the hallway and saw that the front door was wide open. A million thoughts ran through my head at that moment, and I clutched the kitchen knife tightly. I wasn't sure if I had forgotten to lock it the last time I closed the front door. I knew my mother wouldn't have just come home without announcing herself and leaving the door open. I felt my jean pocket, but I didn't have my phone on me. I had left it by the couch where I'd been sitting all night. I didn't know who had opened the door or where they were, so there was only one thing I could do. I bolted straight down that hallway as fast as my legs could carry me, and holding the knife out in front of me. I ran straight out the front door and across the street to my neighbor's house. They'd been having kids knock on their door all night, so they were shocked when they opened the door to me banging on it. I practically rushed inside, scaring the living daylights out of them. They managed to calm me down while they called the cops. When they got there and searched my house, they found that it was empty, but there was someone there because they'd taken my Xbox and the television with them. My mother gave me hell for the incident for a whole month after that, but she was happy that I was okay. All I can say about that night is I'm glad I didn't go trick-or-treating, because then my mother would have been left home alone, and who knows what could have happened to her.